Live from Austin, Texas.
And Rockville, Maryland.
Charlie.
And Andre.
Hey man, how are you doing?
I'm doing alright. How about yourself?
Doing well, man. I thought we did pretty, we had a little bit of feedback on that other podcast that we did, and we thought we might we talked about the timeline of Star Wars Galaxy, and we were thinking about talking about the history of Arda and the history of the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion.
Yeah, definitely thought we'd stick on that geek train a little while longer, because here on this podcast, that's what we do. It's kind of our thing. Discussion and analysis of lore, of various famous authors, imaginary worlds. You can discuss science, literature, philosophy, history, biology, astronomy, pop culture, music, you name it. We'll probably eventually have it on this podcast. And of course, we're open to requests from viewers as well.
We're consummate nerds.
And we're thinking what better topic to do next than Tolkien's legendary world of Middle-earth. Of course, most of our viewers are probably familiar with J.R.R. Tolkien's works. He's most well known for The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, which of course were very popular books and made into very popular movies as well. But a lot of people don't know that there is a much deeper world behind all of that stretches back millennia, and the author Tolkien devised this very intricate, very detailed history and backstory to flesh out his world, which he actually called Arda. And we're going to just kind of go through some of the major events in the First Age, which was actually thousands of years before the Third Age, in which the Lord of the Rings and all the well-known characters we have. So, Frodo, Gandalf, Sam, Gollum, all those. And most of this is actually detailed in the book called the Silmarillion, which is about the creation of the world and how it became what it would be, and how that all kind of led up to the more familiar setting that most viewers and readers know and love.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, they're like the movies have made The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings really popular, and rightly so. They're great books, and they're pretty. The Lord of the Rings were an excellent series. I mean, I believe The Return of the King got an Oscar for best movie that year. And we just kind of wanted to talk about more like the timeline, putting things in perspective, especially with this new show coming out on Amazon. That's pretty cool. There's this whole history that J.R.R. Tolkien kind of put in there, and his posterity, including his son Christopher Tolkien, kind of took forward. And it kind of, one of the key points of history is the Silmarillion, right?
Yeah, so interesting thing is, when Tolkien devised this world of his, this sort of legendarium, he set out to create a sort of fictional or mythical legendary backstory to Europe, especially Britain and Western Europe, with Middle-earth. So Middle-earth was supposed to be this mythical time and place in the deep past of Britain. And this was both his way of connecting it to the real world in some way, and I think he wanted to add more content and flavor to the early history and mythology of England. The Anglo-Saxons were a topic he was very interested in personally, and a lot of their tales were not written down or lost, so this was kind of his way of adding to that mythology in a sense.
Yes. I think he quipped somewhere. He almost makes a joke that he picked up this manuscript and it's like a lost history of that portion of the world, and he's just translating it from like this lost language, which is kind of crazy to think about.
All right, so where do we start? I guess in the beginning there was Eru or Iluvatar, and this might sound somewhat biblical, akin to Genesis, and that was, I think, certainly intentional on Tolkien's part, because he was a staunch Catholic, actually. So he created this Genesis-like story to account for the beginning of the world of Arda, which contained Middle-earth, by this god called Ilúvatar, or Eru, meaning the One. And at first it was just this primordial void out there, and basically he created these godlike beings called the Valar, each of which had its own different attributes, and under them there were the Maiar, which were similar to them but lesser in power. And they created this music. It was this music which actually gave shape to the world, which turned that, chaotic cosmos into a world of, all the mountains, oceans, hills, rivers, streams, forests. It all kind of breathed life into the world and made order out of chaos. But there was a problem. And that problem's name was Melkor. He was one of the Valar. He was one of the strongest, next to Manwë, which was the head Valar. He, in parallel with Lucifer from, the Bible, he wanted to do things his own way, and he introduced a sort of discord or dissonance into the music, and basically went against the harmony that the other Valar created. And this was like the split that caused all of the later problems of the world of Arda. Melkor kind of went his own way, and instead of creating, he was more interested in destroying that which the other Valar created, because he wasn't really capable of creating beautiful things like the others, and all he could do was actually twist the shapes of existing things into, these terrible mutated forms, as would later happen with the Elves, which he turned into the orcs, for example. But yeah, that's basically how the world was created. Charlie, do you have anything to add to this?
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty crazy. Basically, in the beginning of the Silmarillion, you get straight to it. There's this monotheistic god, Eru Ilúvatar, and he has this music of the Ainur, which is kind of this great song of the holy ones. The Ainur is translated from the Quenya as the divine spirits, the holy ones, and through that song, he kind of creates the Valar and the Maiar, and then he kind of has these themes going on at the same time. He kind of has the first theme of music, but then, like you said, Melkor kind of brings dissonance, and that's sort of the evil in the world, is this dissonance in music. So he has this initial song that's very beautiful. It's like this timeless halls of pass beyond the void, and then it ceases to be void. And then Melkor kind of brings this dissonance because he has different thoughts. That's how it's described. It's very abstract and very interesting at the same time. And then the second theme is described as like and unlike the first theme. And so it kind of changes things. But then Melkor once again brings up this discord and this dissonance. It's the word that Tolkien uses is dissonance. It's very interesting. And then so that didn't work out. So we go to the third theme, and it's described as unlike. He uses the word unlike. So it begins kind of at the end of the second one, and it's repetitive, it's sorrowful, it's kind of cool, and it ends when Eru Ilúvatar puts his arms up, and the music ceased. So that's kind of the beginning of when the void ceased being void. So I think it's really cool. It's very abstract. It's very musical. You don't get the music, but it's up to your imagination. So that's how the Silmarillion, and that's how the world of Lord of the Rings kind of starts off in the Legendarium.
So basically, after this music of the Valar, I think called the Ainulin Dale, the world was shaped, and in order to light Middle Earth, the Valar created these two great lamps in the north and south of the continent, and all was well for a while and peaceful and harmonious until Melkor, out of anger and jealousy, decided to destroy those lamps, and then a war with the other Valar ensued. and eventually I think Tulkas, which was like the sort of wrestler Valar, he was able to take Melkor down.
He's the guy who enters and like he enters Arda, which is the world that Eärendil, and Melkor sort of flees. Uh,
And Melkor then was imprisoned, I believe, in chains for like many hundreds of years, if not more, because they don't really say how long exactly this era was, because it's not a time when any mortals were around, so perception of time might have been totally different than what we understand.
mm,
Yes, it says here in Encyclopedia of Arda, one of the many wikis for The Lord of the Rings and Tolkien's Legendarium, others which include Tolkien Gateway and LOTR fandom, says that he was imprisoned in the halls of Mandos for 3 ages by Tulkas' chain, and then after a while he was paroled to Valinor, which is the land of the gods that's separated from Middle Earth across a vast ocean. And many of the other Valar still mistrusted him while he was there, but he sort of, in true Melkor fashion, gradually deceived them and came to be believed that he was now sort of reformed, and he was eventually let go. This was a mistake, as they later found out. Anyway, after the lamps were destroyed, the Valar went to go dwell in Valinor, the land of the West, the Undying Lands, as they were also known. And they planted these 2 great trees called the Telperion and Lorelin, the 2 trees of Valinor. And they came to replace the lamps as the way to light the world. And I believe from them the light of the Silmarils was also taken.
yes, and that's the years of the trees. So we move on from the years of the lamps and we go on to the years of the trees.
So all of this that the Valar are doing was actually in preparation of Eru Luvatar, God's children, which came in basically 2 forms. The firstborn would be the Elves, who would not succumb to death through old age. They could die through illness and violence.
But otherwise immortal, yeah.
And then the second born, who were special in their own way, were supposed to be men, like humans, like us, mankind. And they, unlike the elves, were mortal, and which in some way you can see as like a detriment or a flaw, but it was also conversely, from another perspective, seen as a gift. But we'll get into that later. So yeah, the elves woke in the far, far east of Middle Earth, I believe in a place called Cuivienen, and their task was to make it all the way west to Valinor, where they were summoned, but they had to make this great trek across the whole continent.
It's a beautiful scene. It's very literary, and like the first word that they say is ele, which is in Quenya star. So they wake up on the shores of awakening on a lake, of the shores of awakening, and the first thing they do, they look up and they see the stars, and they're like ele ele. And if you read the books, when Frodo meets an elf for the first time, he says Elen lumen silvalmenti elvo, which means a star shines on the moment of our meeting. Ellen being the word for star. So that awakening scene is actually probably my favorite scene in the Silmarillion. It's so beautiful.
And along the way, several groups of them kind of split off and became their own separate tribes and stayed and lingered in Middle Earth, even up until the time of the Lord of the Rings. And all these different kind of dialects and whatnot evolved, like Sindarin of the Grey Elves, Quenya of the High Elves, and many others. You had like some of the elves that stayed there in the forest in the east becoming the Dark Elves or Avari, and then I believe there's like 3 main groups that became the High Elves that actually made the push all the way to the west, the Vanyar, the Noldor, and the Teleri. And like the Vanyar are the ones that are the closest to the Valar and most faithful. the Noldor were the ones who, as we'll see later, had one of the more tragic but dramatic destinies in Middle Earth, and they were great craftsmen. Um, and then the Teleri were more like seafarers and kind of kept to themselves. And I believe they didn't actually make it all the way to Valinor, but stayed on an island near it. I think out of those dark elves that were there, they later evolved into the wood elves of like Mirkwood and so on. And I think added to them, like their rulers were from the Sindarin, which were part of some of the ones that went to Valinor and then came back, I believe.
And they all develop their own sort of dialects. Like the Sindarin it's almost like comparing Latin with what like the modern romances today. Quenya is sort of the Latin, and Sindarin is one of the more more modern languages as it has evolved. And what's cool is that Tolkien is a linguist in real life, and he takes these languages. He starts off with Quenya, he kind of creates it, and then he takes it not as an artificial manipulation of what Sindarin would be, but actually how languages are noted to evolve. Especially in Indo-European, we have these shifts of consonants and vowel sounds, and he did it to mirror exactly how languages change. That's just simply incredible.
Oh yeah, of course. Tolkien was a philologist and very acquainted with linguistics of ancient languages, phonological evolution, etymologies, so on. And he's especially interested in like Germanic languages like Old Norse and Anglo-Saxon, and then also Finnish, which he all kind of used as different inspirations for languages in his own world. And you could tell he very much knew his stuff, and this adds just like a whole nother level of depth and nuance that I don't think you really get in almost any other fictional world or legendarium to that level. I mean, the Klingons sure had their own language in Star Trek, but it's not nearly as developed, from what I understand, as this. And there's also different stages and histories to these languages, and they change over time. So as someone who myself is very interested in linguistics, I can say it's pretty fascinating stuff.
Yes.
However, though, before the elves awoke, something interesting happened, which was kind of a irregularity. So Aule, which was like the smith god or Valar, he was impatient and wanted to create his own living beings, sort of in his image in a way, and molded what became the dwarves, that we know in like the form of Gimli and whatnot, from like mud and dirt. However, Iluvatar found out about this and forbade them from awakening before the true firstborn, which were the elves, his creation.
Yeah, so technically they were created before the elves were created, but since he disobeyed Aule's dwarven people, they have to wait. Um, yeah, and there's a famous by Ted Naismith where he's like he has a hammer because he's frequently depicted as a hammer, and he's going to destroy his creation, but they end up deciding to keep his creation, but they just wake up after the elves.
So until the elves properly awoke, the dwarves were basically asleep and would remain so for quite a while. I believe one of the first ones that woke among the seven like fathers of the dwarves was Durin the Deathless. I think he established like the dynasty that would last all the way until the Third Age, into a more familiar era as one of the most famous like clan of dwarves. So back in Valinor, where all the action's really happening, all the elves make it and settle down. The Vanyar are having a good time. Everything's kind of groovy for a little while. The Noldor, which are great craftsmen, among their houses, Feanor, who's a key character in the Silmarillion. He's the one who desires to craft these great jewels that capture the essence of the two trees.
Yeah, he begins construction. Feanor, like, Melkor is doing some stuff in the background. Right before that, like, Galadriel is born. But basically, Feanor begins his construction. He completes the Silmarils, and he puts the light from the trees in those Silmarils. And kind of the Barda, like, they kind of worship them, or I don't know if worship is the right word. They kind of hallow them.
The Noldor were a very proud people, and they, valued their artifacts and craftsmanship.
Yeah, they're very proud, but unfortunately, Melkor starts, fomenting trouble just as the Silmarils are created. And actually, Melkor meets with Feanor, uh, but they end up having like a falling out. Uh, and Gouliat ultimately destroys the two trees. Uh, I don't know if we've mentioned Finwë yet, but Melkor kills Finwë and steals the Silmarils. And Feanor changes Melkor's name into Morgoth. Uh,
The Black Foe or the Dark Tyrant.
yeah, yeah,
But I think up until then, he actually appeared to the elves in like a fair form to kind of deceive them, in a similar way that Sauron, I believe, his apprentice later would in the Second Age. But I think at a certain point, Morgoth lost the ability to become that way and stayed this like noticeably evil-looking, menacing form.
yeah.
So after Feanor finds out that Melkor stole the Silmarils and escaped to Middle Earth, where he has a stronghold called Angband, he decided to gather up all his Noldor homies, or at least the ones that were willing to come with him, and trek all the way back to Middle Earth to fight him and take them back by force, because he was so proud of this creation, and basically their destiny becomes entwined with them. And not only does Morgoth steal the Silmarils, he actually uses the spider spirit Ungoliant to destroy the trees, which was like a huge blow to the Valar.
And Golion destroys the trees. Golion destroys the trees. Yeah. So it's just a lot of stuff is going on, and they don't touch on it in the movies. I mean, they kind of indirectly do, but a lot of this stuff is going on. It's really cool with Silmaril.
So at this point, the Noldor, led by Feanor, cross over this like frozen sort of land bridge that's all treacherous in the far north that connects the tip of Valinor to the tip of Middle Earth, a thing called the Helcarax. And there were several casualties along the way, but this kind of was the start of the sundering or split of the elves, because the Vanyar, for example, stayed back in Valinor, as did the Teleri.
Yeah, the sundering of the elves. Yeah.
The Noldor, when they returned to the northwest of Middle Earth, also known as Beleriand,
Valyrian.
they arrived. They found other elves that had stayed there and never crossed into Valinor. These were like, I believe, the Gray Elves, or the Sindarin speakers, and then they kind of started to cohabitate with them and mingle with them because they had a common enemy in Morgoth, who had just arrived to the north in his impregnable mountain fortress, full of all kinds of terrors that were unimaginable.
No, I mean the Wars of Beleriand are a big chunk of it, and it's notable that the elves and the dwarves actually united in that war against Morgoth.
Yeah, the dwarves of the Blue Mountains, which would be one of the parts of Beleriand that actually survives into the later ages of Middle Earth. And you wouldn't think, because usually the elves and dwarves do not get along historically, and for the most part they still mistrusted each other. The dwarves are like very much associated with like the depths, caverns, tunnels, jewels, mining, that kind of thing, and look very different, while the elves were more about greenery, nature, more intellectual pursuits, spirituality, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I believe some of the dwarves did help them and fought with them, but then others didn't. There are always some bad eggs in all these different peoples, as we see. men, elves, and dwarves. In the case of men, it's often the Easterlings who stayed behind in Middle Earth. That would be the bad guys, as we'll see, but we're kind of jumping ahead of ourselves. So they fight a few initial battles against Morgoth, which are actually successful at kind of holding him at bay. Fortunately, at this point, Feanor actually succumbs to battle with Gothmog, one of Sauron's greatest lieutenants, who was a Balrog. So that's where his story ends. But his three sons, I believe, survive, and they vow vengeance for this, and still are obsessed with the idea of taking back the Silmarils, and their fate is pretty entwined with the rest of the story. And then they begin this siege of Angband, in which he's kind of lays low and stays up in Angband in this huge, impregnable chain of mountains. And there's a lot of other kind of intrigue that happens in Beleriand at the time with the elves who kind of established these cities, and they kind of really, entrench themselves and take a liking to Middle Earth, even though it's not, this idyllic, holy, undying land that they used to live in because of their attachment to the Silmarils and their kind of mission there. It kind of grows on them. And although I think some of the elf leaders, Fingolfin, he challenges Morgoth to a one-on-one duel and gets killed, unfortunately. But as I said, like, the elves win this glorious battle. I think they call it Dagor Aglareb. So things are kind of okay for a little while.
Yes, yeah. There's a lot of intrigue and betrayal, and on both ends.
And so around the time that the drama first started unfolding in Beleriand in the northwest of Middle Earth with Morgoth and the elves, in the far east, in Hildorian, the men awakened with the coming of the sun and the moon, because up until then there were only stars, which is what the elves woke under, and of course the light of the trees, which were now gone. So thus the sun and moon came to replace them. And this ushered in the first age of Middle Earth as we know it, the age that men awoken.
The year of the trees, the years of the trees sort of end with the sun, or the sun following the moon. Because the moon and the sun are created, kind of giving this new source of light, because it used to just be in the trees from the Silmarils. And in the first age, basically, the moon first rises, and then the sun follows it, and then the men awake. We had the awakening of the elves. We have the awakening of the men at the Hildorine.
And the men also begin their trek westwards. They, in contrast to the elves, were not promised a land in Valinor in the Undying Lands, because they are mortal and meant to stay in Middle Earth. So there's several groups that kind of gradually make their way west toward Beleriand. Some kind of linger more in the east of Middle Earth, become the Easterlings. But there's others that go south and become the ancestors of the Dunlendings and even the Woesmen. And then others who were of a more, I guess, noble branch that stayed a little further east became the ancestors of the Northmen and eventually the Rohirrim of Rohan. And then finally, the most important ones in Tolkien's story were the ones that became known as the Edain, the ones that went all the way to Beleriand and became allied to the elves in their fight against Morgoth. And due to the sacrifices they made in this war, they were later promised, a land in the ocean, became the Dunedain, ancestors to Aragorn, and they were known as Men of the West in Tolkien's etymology. I will say it's worth mentioning one somewhat contentious point about how Tolkien portrays men of the East, the Easterlings, versus men of the West in somewhat arguably, according to some, black and white terms where the Easterlings are more evil and they might represent people from, further to the east of Europe and in this sort of imagining. That is somewhat controversial. However,
Yeah,
not all Easterlings were bad. I mean, some, I believe the followers of Bor were actually good and helped the Edain and the Elves, while others betrayed them. And this was the case later on in later ages as well with the Easterlings. Interestingly enough, I have a colleague of mine who actually is a huge Tolkien geek and is actually getting a master's in Tolkienology and writing about these kinds of topics and how they kind of intersect with our own real world and how different viewers might interpret them and whatnot.
oh, the Easterlings are forgiven by Aragorn, right? At the end of the Return of the
Yeah, I believe they are.
Yeah. I mean, Aragorn shows himself to be a very magnanimous, very nice guy. A nice guy. Yeah, I mean, in the age of the first age, things start going crazy because you get the age of men, and then things really start moving things along, and just everybody's like, there's all these characters, and then Morgoth is like breaks that siege of Angband that has been going on forever, um, and of course you have some stories such as Beren and Lúthien are mentioned, the quest of the Silmaril. Uh,
Yes, who could forget the famous tragic romance that is Beren and Lúthien. I think he was a man, a mortal man, while she was like an elf who was part Maiar, actually. Beren was from one of the three houses of the Edain men. I think the House of Beor, I believe. And Beren's quest was to retrieve the Silmaril that was taken by Morgoth and being kept. I believe he was able to take it while Morgoth was sleeping from his iron crown. And I believe at some point Beren actually wrestles with Sauron, who was a lieutenant of Morgoth at this time. He took some kind of strange werewolf form, because that was his thing at the time. He would shift forms and... Or no, wait, it was the great, hound companion that Beren had, like Huan or something like that. I guess to give a little background on Sauron, since this was the first time we mentioned him, he was originally one of the Maiar, not quite the Valar level, but below them and still immortal, very powerful spirits. Each of those Maiar tended to work under with a Valar that was sort of akin to them or in their sphere of interest. And Sauron was originally apprenticed, I believe, to Aule the Smith, until eventually he was corrupted by Melkor and then turned, indelibly evil, and never really came back. And then he went with Morgoth and served him until his demise, and then became the second Dark Lord later, as we all know.
yeah, it's a beautiful story. I think Aragorn and at the end of the Return of the King, you kind of have the story of Aragorn and his love for an elven princess, the daughter of Elrond.
Arwen, yeah.
And they compare it to Beren and Lúthien, where Beren and Lúthien take one of Silmaril from Morgoth.
Yeah.
The thing is, it's a very interesting story because it's kind of like this forbidden love story. You know what I mean? Beren is a man, right? And Lúthien is an elf, so they kind of have this forbidden love that Aragorn and Arwen have. So it's but she is I think she's like descended from a Maya. I think her mother is a Mayan and her father is King Thingol, who's one of the elves.
Yeah, fun fact though, I think among Beren and Lúthien's descendants are Eärendil, and that's the line of Elros and Elrond, and eventually through the kings of Númenor and the Dúnedain all the way down to Aragorn. So he is actually a descendant of Beren, as is Arwen through Elrond. So that's kind of interesting.
And so it's interesting because you kind of have that forbidden love in the context of death, because death is a big issue that's brought up in Lord of the Rings. Men are given the gift of death, in Lord of the Rings, as it's described in the Silmarillion. And the elves almost envy men because men are able to pass away, and it's seen as a gift.
Yeah, that's definitely a pretty interesting perspective from both a philosophical and religious kind of point of view. Yeah, us humans have the ability to basically shuffle off this mortal coil, so to speak.
Yeah, shuffle off this mortal coil from whose born no traveler returns, puzzles the will, and makes us rather bear those ills we have than turn to others that we know not of.
Yeah, Charlie's a resident Shakespeare master who's got it all memorized.
But that's for another podcast, right? But
And I think it was around this time that like the epic and tragic saga of Túrin Turambar, one of the ill-fated sons of Húrin of the House of Hador, happened. And he was sort of this anti-hero who was both a hero who slayed one of the first dragons, Glaurung, but was also driven by anger and revenge. He had lost several friends, like Beleg, his elf friend, and he had married a woman named Ninor, but then through some tragic misunderstanding, she ended up killing their own son, and he killed her in a fit of rage. And he eventually met a untimely death as well after slaying the dragon. I guess this story is kind of like a reminder that even the best of us can be led astray by our own dark impulses.
yeah, he goes to Gondolin, Glaurung. It's like kind of this. It's one of the first dragons, and it was like one of the lieutenants with Morgoth from the first age, and also Sauron is one of the lieutenants.
Yeah, I think Glaurung was created by Morgoth to sort of break the siege of Angband and what was known as the Battle of Sudden Flame. Like the elves had him under siege for like several hundred years and weren't expecting that. And out of nowhere, this huge dragon with this devastating flame breath came and kind of turned the tide.
Right.
I think along with dragons, he also devised the Balrogs, which we know of from Moria and the epic battle between Gandalf and the Balrog, the Bridge of Khazad-dûm. You shall not pass. But apparently, interestingly, their origins were corrupted Maiar, similar to Sauron, who became twisted into these like demonic, fiery forms and served as some of Morgoth's most powerful soldiers and lieutenants against his enemies. And that one, known as Durin's Bane, survived the cataclysm of the end of the First Age and slept under the mountains for thousands of years.
The Durin's Bane, the Balrog in Moria. Yeah, basically Morgoth was defeated in the War of the Wrath, and he kind of just escaped into the Misty Mountains, and he lived there for like 5,000 years. Just speaking from caloric intake perspective, I'm not sure how he was surviving if he was so large, but we don't need to start analyzing this from an evolutionary perspective. But
I don't know, maybe goblins, dwarves. But yeah, let's save the evolutionary talk for a different podcast. I am excited for that one, though.
he would have to have a massive intake of goblins, I'd imagine. That, from an economic perspective, I think like the Goblin King, even though they're disorganized and everything, they probably would have launched some sort of campaign. But I digress a little bit.
But of course, the majority of Morgoth's just foot soldiers and troops were orcs, which, as we mentioned before, were originally just corrupted elves that were tortured and twisted. But he also had like Easterlings serving under him and various other monsters and trolls, which he created possibly out of like twisted ents. And yeah, one of the big events toward the end of the First Age was the siege and fall of Gondolin, which was like this beautiful city that the elves built in the mountains in the middle of Beleriand, and it was like hidden for most of the First Age and untouched by the wars until this point.
The fall of Gondolin was a big event. Yeah, there's so much artwork on recent books this past like 10, 15 years. Gondolin is beautiful, but it was destroyed.
Yeah, I think Gondor was actually betrayed by one of the Dark Elves, Maeglin. Anyway, coming toward the end of the first age in this podcast, Morgoth is increasingly defeating his enemies, and there's like this battle where I think the Easterlings betray everybody else, and it's called the Battle of Unnumbered Tears, the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, and then things look like they're grimace, like he's about to, take over the elven kingdoms of Middle Earth and dominate everyone. When finally the tide is turned because Eärendil, the Mariner,
Aaron?
a heroic elf, goes on a quest to Valinor to beseech the help of the Valar against Morgoth in Middle Earth. They'd left it alone for far too long and had to intervene somehow, or else they would lose, the whole continent. Even though they admitted it was partly the folly and pride of the Noldor that allowed this whole thing to happen in the first place.
Yeah, and Elwing come to Valinor to like rally a great host, right? The host of Valinor.
Yeah, and I believe Eonwë, the Maiar, who's the herald of the main Vala Manwë, is like the uh, head of the army, the host of Valinor that attacks Morgoth, along with their, um, host of Vanyar, like the Elves that stayed in Valinor, and the Eagles, and all these other fighters.
Yeah.
I think at this point Morgoth had one more ace up his sleeve in the form of Ancalagon, which was like this truly enormous black dragon, like the largest that ever existed. But they were able to take him down, and I think in falling down out of the sky, it fell so hard that it destroyed half of the mountain range of Thangorodrim that was surrounding Angband and caused some cataclysmic earthquakes around that part of Middle Earth.
Calagon. Yeah. Well, before the destruction of Beleriand and the deaths of Ancalagon, and the elven guy Medeiros, Morgoth is sort of kicked out of. Morgoth is kicked out of.
Yeah, I think Morgoth was just cast out of the doors of night into the back into the black void outside of Arda or existence, from where the Vala originally came, and he was locked out to the point where he could never return to Arda again. Although in some form, in a poetic form, his spirit lingered on through the evil seeds he planted throughout, the hearts of people in Middle Earth, as well as obviously through his successor Sauron.
Right.
So, because this War of Wrath, as it was known, was so cataclysmic, a lot of that part of Middle Earth was destroyed. Many of the Noldor already died in the war anyway. The ones that remained mostly returned to Valinor because they were sort of given that right again and were pardoned. Other elves stayed in Middle Earth and moved further west because Beleriand kind of sank into the sea, except for one small portion of it. Some of the remaining men were gifted a island in the middle of the sea called Numenor at the beginning of the Second Age. Those were the Edain, the ones who fought faithfully under the Elves. And over time, the Numenorean descendants would eventually become exiled to Middle Earth and found the kingdoms of Arnor and Gondor, but we'll get to that some other time.
But that's the second age.
And the two sons of Eärendil, the half-elf mariner who sailed back to Valinor to tell the Valar about that the elves needed help, his two sons were Elros and Elrond. Elros chose to become a man and became king of Numenor and was mortal but long-lived. And his brother Elrond, as we know, chose to become basically an elf, and he is immortal. And then finally, Sauron, he escaped all this calamity and went into hiding for many centuries until he kind of resurfaced later in the Second Age. So it's interesting how even some of the characters that we know from The Lord of the Rings had their roots back in this time and have lived for all these thousands of years in some form, including Galadriel. But yeah, that about sums it up, I think, Charlie.
That's a quick summary of the beginning.
Probably not so quick for some of our listeners, but trust us, there's a lot of stuff in there, and we even had to skip a lot of it.
It's cool stuff.
This was kind of a, high level summary of all the major events in the First Age. However, I really recommend reading the book yourselves because Tolkien describes all of these places, cities, mountains, valleys, in vivid descriptive detail, and it's really worth checking out for yourself if you haven't already, of course.
Yeah, and it gets even funner with the Numenor and the battle of the three, the rings, and it's really cool. But I think we did pretty good summary. I think.
So yeah, folks, it's been a pleasure having you. Thank you for watching, and please like or subscribe if you're interested. Let us know in the comments if you have any questions or want to find out more or have any suggestions or requests for future videos.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your time. And I think that wraps up our discussion of this timeline over here from reflecting on the Silmarillion and Lord of the Rings.
Until next time, this has been Andre and Charlie.
So long.